A Pew Research conducted about a global survey conducted to see what attitudes towards Israel and its prime minister are, showed something not really surprising. Most people are anti-Israel. Depending on the country, they may be more anti-Israel or less anti-Israel. I mean, some of the most concerning ones are not, for example, the fact that 93% of people in Turkey are against Israel because if you're basically putting your hopes for the future on Turkey, we're kind of screwed. In the US, though, 53% of respondents said that they hold a negative opinion of Israel, which is an 11-point increase from 2022. Already sounds a bit high. And again, you know, this is where our hopes should lie, is the United States of America. In some countries, of course, it is much worse. We will go through the numbers and discuss it on today's show and try to figure out what this means and what we can do to combat it other than sharing the Ayn Rand Center UK's content. Welcome to the reality show. I'm Razi Ginsburg. I'm joined by Daniel Kraus and Adam Mossoff. Adam, your first thoughts when you see that survey?
Yeah, so I would be interested to know if the survey also dug a little deeper into some in a more granular level distinguishing between Democrats and Republicans. Um, because my suspicion is that support for Israel has gone up among people who affiliate or associate with Republicans, and support for Israel is near zero now among almost all Democrats. Um, and this is really kind of representative of the fact that, it is this kind of woke leftist intersectional perspective on the world that there are the oppressed and the oppressors, and you can understand every system through that. And this old kind of Soviet style propaganda that Israel is this capitalistic, white colonial colonizer oppressing the local natives who are the Palestinians, has really taken hold, especially given through that framework that has come to dominate almost the entirety of the left in the United States, and some of the populist right. I shouldn't say it's just not just the left.
Uh, Before I go to Daniel, Adam, I want to ask you because the Republican Party has, let's put it nicely, not gotten better in recent years, but
Yeah.
what you're pointing out in the Democrats is really terrifying. I said on a show recently, and I think some people were unhappy that the best, quarter of the way into the century. The best president America has had so far this century is George W. Bush, which is really, that's in my opinion, and it is really a scary thought. It's I remember looking at politics and thinking, okay, the Democrats are pretty bad. The Republicans, the ones who are likely to be potentially the next presidential nominee, are also pretty bad. But there are some voices that sound semi-reasonable, and also among the Democrats, there were the occasional. What are they called? Blue something. I don't remember what they were. There was some name for
I think
Democrats.
Blue Dogs.
Blue
Yeah,
dogs. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that are like semi-reasonable. I don't know if those still exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do
Conservative
you think of that
Democrats.
assessment generally?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's generally right. I mean, there, the I mean, it's a little hard, especially for objectivists, because a lot of support for Israel comes from, of course, religious conservatives who support Israel because of the connections with Judeo-Christianity, in Jerusalem, and kind of Israel's connections to that area and that land, specifically, in the Bible. I've had objectivists point out to me like, well, the only reason why, the conservatives right now support Israel is because of the religion. And it's like, yes, that's true, certainly for some of them. I think others actually do recognize that Israel is also a beacon of Western civilization in a incredibly barbaric, dark area, dark ages of the world. Um, But we also have to hold context, like even the things that are said correctly by Democrats sometimes about, freedom of choice or, and other and free speech and things of that sort at times, right? They don't fully understand it either. They're not arguing these positions because they believe in individual rights and that these are rooted in you know absolute individual rights that need to be asserted against the state just as much as asserted against other individuals and things of this sort. So, I mean, we reached a situation in the world today where we're kind of stuck between opposing forces that fundamentally agree on a lot of foundational collectivist premises.
Yeah. Thank you, PC, for the super chat. PC says Razi Bush is a liberal, LOL. And later on, PC says George H.W. Bush was way more conservative than his son is. So I don't agree with the use of either of those terms. First of all, I wish he was a liberal. And the people who call themselves liberal in America are anything but liberal. And I don't see conservative as a positive thing. There are things,
Yeah,
that maybe should be conserved, and there are things that absolutely should not be. And yeah, I mean, we were talking, I think, over the weekend with Mark, right? I was talking about like political slogans, and I remember George H.W. Bush was one who had a slogan that was actually to the point. It wasn't hope and change, and make America great again. It was read my lips, no new taxes. Like that's a statement. Of course, he raised taxes, but we've come a long way in many, many unfortunate ways. Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, just to comment on the liberal thing, I mean, again, it really depends how you define liberal. Technically, every single American president was a liberal, if you define it as sort of like support of liberal democracy, sort of support for separation of powers, and in that way. I sort of agree that it shouldn't be associated with the left, because it's like a good concept that we shouldn't let the left steal, as they did with many other things. So,
yeah.
but yeah, Adam has earlier mentioned if there is like a difference. So in this survey, they did make a difference. They didn't do Democrats, Republicans. They did right versus left. And
Hmm.
America had one of the biggest like differences, like 44-point the difference between the right and the left. So 74% of the left view Israel as unfavorable, as compared to 30% of people on the right. Yeah, there's definitely, and it is one of the biggest sort of splits, and it is truly something that is kind of baffling. I think Democrats are really sort of like failing almost themselves by associated with the radical parts of the left so much. Like if you really think about it, they pretty much lost election because the Kamala Harris was viewed as too pro-Israeli. Like many people would rather vote for like Jill Stein because Kamala Harris was too pro-Israeli for them. Once you
Yeah.
have like a political party that is like this sort of like divided between sort of like what is, let's say, like the core of the party and sort of the radical elements, and they are still giving in to the radical elements, I think that really sort of will sort of like destroy the party from within. So I can understand why many people, especially people who are pro-Israeli, and again, you even have to define what pro-Israel means, because if we say pro-Israel, what do we mean? Sort of like Israel properly establishing itself in Gaza, finishing the war properly. There's not that many who are really pro-Israeli. If you think just pro-Israeli just means sort of you believe in the existence of the state of Israel, then you have much sort of like bigger parts of American society being pro-Israeli. That's why I think now that Israel is establishing itself more, where it's being a bit more active in Gaza, the support goes down because they do not really support Israel in that regard, simply as the sort of like existence. I mean, there's a quote from Joe Biden, and I mean, he's been in politics for way too long. And there's a quote like decades ago when he was like, if there was no Israel, we would have to establish Israel. Like he was viewed as like one of the most Israeli sort of pro-Israeli people on the Democratic side for a long time.
Um, Let me just quickly get to the
And
super chats. Thank you, PC, for another super chat. PC says, Razi, do all these people love
yeah.
Palestine then? If you mean what the presidents we were talking about, I don't know where they stand. I mean, George Bush Sr. did force Israel into the Madrid conference that started the so-called peace talks, and of course part of the way that the U.S. got Israel to participate is by putting out some statement that the U.S. is against the creation of a Palestinian state. Of course, that didn't last because that is a statement that one president can make and then the next president can take away.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. Jonathan says, Adam, like Dr. Peikoff, is the type of professor you wish you had in college. Absolutely, he's the type of professor I
Well,
wish I
thank you.
could go back in time and actually go to college in order to have such a professor. So
Well, thank
let's
you.
hear from Professor Masov.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, um, we're so a couple of things, couple quick things. So from the United States right now, a lot of people don't realize this is going through what is sometimes referred to as a political realignment, where because since we have two parties in the United States, they're big tent parties, and they tend to involve lots of different types of groups of people who care about different things, and people tend and the way that these parties work politically is that people put like some issues that they really care about on the, say, well, okay, I'm willing to set these aside at the moment because I'll join with you on this other issue. And the United States historically has gone through these points in time every 30 or 40 years where it goes through a political realignment, where the respective focuses of the particular parties shift. And voters who once voted for one party start voting for another, and vice versa. This happened for instance, in the 1820s, and then again in the 1850s when the Whig Party collapsed and the Republican Party came into existence. So it happened in the 1960s and early 1980s with the rise of the Blue Dog Democrats, the conservative Democrats, where you had a kind of this classic voting bloc of Democrats in the South because the Democrats were originally the party of racism and still to this day actually, but the party of racism and support of slavery, and they shifted the Republicans through the 70s and 80s, given various shifts. We are going through a political realignment again in the United States. Unfortunately, each time, the realignment is occurring around really bad premises, right? And often does. Um, and so it's the I think it's important though to always remember that yeah, I mean, Biden sometimes says pro things about Israel. He was also known as not a fan of Israel when he was even a senator 30 or 40 years ago. There's actually a meme shared of Menachem Begin basically, talking to or answering questions from then Senator Biden in the early 1980s, where he basically, where Biden was doing his finger wagging at him about Israel and what was going on in Lebanon and stuff at that time, and he was like, "Look, I'm not some weak-kneed Jew who's appearing before you right now begging for your approval. We will do what we need to do to stay alive." And I have had a lot of people say to me, well, after October 7th, Biden said he was a Zionist and was supporting Israel. And I said, yeah. And then immediately after that, he spent the next year and a half doing everything in his power to undermine and stop Israel from actually taking the appropriate responses that it needed to do, including imposing an arms embargo on them, lying about the arms embargo. Finally, when Netanyahu came out and said there was an arms embargo, he admitted it was, then still lied about the scope of it. He said, oh, it's only the big bombs. And then later, of course, it comes out, no, they were embargoing even like ammunition and everything, that they were like actually calling them up and stopping them from taking particular actions. Biden stopped Netanyahu from striking Iran's nuclear facilities after the first rocket attack. And of course now Trump is holding Israel back too. So, I mean, it's just, you see all of occurs on both sides of the existing political spectrum, which objectively is not the right political spectrum. Political spectrum, as we know, should be individualism, freedom, capitalism versus collectivism and statism. But right now we're on a political spectrum of statism and different degrees and variations of that. Yeah.
Um, Daniel, do you
Yeah,
want to go first or should I? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. If I can just jump in, because I feel like maybe I sounded like I'm saying like Biden is this like pro-Israeli guy.
Yeah.
Because yesterday we had a talk with Kit Wiener, and he mentioned one of sort of like Ayn Rand's sort of concept, and is the idea that when things are muddy, when things are ill-defined, when things are not defined, that's when the evil wins, right? So that's why sort of like being pro-Israel, being sort of like what Israel means has to be defined. Because you can say you're like pro-Israel and then, like Chuck Schumer call for getting rid of Netanyahu because he's not in our interest. Or the fact that like, yeah, Biden famously hates Netanyahu. And, sort of like we are not the biggest fans of Netanyahu either, but sort of like calling for like a removal of a head of state of your supposed ally, that's like a crazy thing to really put out there. So it has to be defined what pro-Israel means. And the fact is that very few people define it. They just say, they just have some vague notion of like Israel should exist, but it shouldn't really do anything in Gaza. It did way too much. So it should both sort of like it's the same thing that we have been doing when it comes to conducting our wars, right? We're never fully recognizing what is the enemy. We're never fully recognizing what is the goal. We don't really know what is like the point even of American system. We just sort of like go through the notions and see where we end up without sort of like ever defining anything. So that's why oftentimes it's always funny to hear people like Mehdi Hassan, I'm not sure if you know him, when they say things like there are no pro-Palestinian voices on American media. And when I hear that, it's like, what are you talking about? But for them, it's like as soon as you believe like Israel should even exist, that's you are being too much pro-Israeli. So
Yeah.
that's when concepts like really have to be defined, because otherwise people just can run away with anything.
Um, Okay, yeah, oh yeah, I wanted just to follow up on that with yeah, when I say Bush was the best president in this century so far, and people are upset with me, I'm not saying he was good. I'm saying all the others are so much worse. And one of the examples, or at least worse, one of the examples is yeah, Bush responded to 9/11 by saying Islam is a religion of peace, and then going to war for regime change in a couple of countries that it was easy to get a coalition around, but his regime change was, in Afghanistan and Iraq. Biden's regime change was Israel. That's where we've come. And yeah, I think Trump certainly, even with his current
True way to
attitude
put it.
toward Israel, is an improvement on this specific point, but not the improvement we'd like to see. Thank you, Nomad, for the super chat. Nomad asks, "Can anyone discuss Ayn Rand's opinion on Israel?" Well, let's actually read Ayn Rand's opinion on Israel.
Okay. Yeah,
This
it's
is
awesome.
from
Yeah, he's got it.
Yeah, I have this book right next to me, mostly because I read the part about Iran, but yeah,
Yeah.
this is from the Q&A in the Ford Hall Forum talk in 1973. What should the United States do about the Arab-Israeli war? And this is her answer. Give all help possible to Israel. Consider what is at stake. It is not the moral duty of any country to send men to die helping another country. The help Israel needs is technology and military weapons, and they need them desperately. Why should we help Israel? Israel is fighting not just the Arabs, but Soviet Russia, who is sending the Arabs armaments. Russia is after control of the Mediterranean and oil. Further, why are the Arabs against Israel? This is the main reason I support Israel. The Arabs are one of the least developed cultures. They are still practically nomads. Their culture is primitive, and they resent Israel because it's the sole beachhead of modern civilization, modern science and civilization on their continent. When you have civilized men fighting savages, you support the civilized men no matter who they are. Israel is a mixed economy inclined towards socialism, but when it comes to the power of the mind, the development of industry in that wasted desert continent versus savages who don't want to use their minds, then if one cares about the future of civilization, don't wait for the government to do something. Give whatever you can. This is the first time I've contributed to a public cause helping Israel in an emergency.
Wow.
Every word of that is amazing, and every word of that, other
Yeah.
than the Soviet Union, although Russia is still relevant, is relevant today. Adam, Daniel, that was 1973.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, entirely. Like, gosh, you, as the kids would say today, you brought the receipts, Razi, on Rand's support for Israel, and it's exactly right. I mean, and and it's even more so now because it's become more free. I mean, so it was so much more socialist back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it's become much more of a. It's still mixed, but economy, but it's a far more free economy now. It's a far more prosperous country. It's a far more successful country, especially compared to the barbarians that they're fighting, and the Arabs that they're fighting. I refuse to use the term Palestinian because that was, as I've mentioned before, that is a Soviet propaganda from the early 1960s that they crafted. When the Soviets decided, as Rand describes, and she says you're fighting the Soviets, to frame, the what was going on in the Middle East as this, we're helping the local, the local oppressed natives versus the colonial capitalist oppressors. And they helped craft this whole, framing, this propaganda framing of the Palestinians. They're Arabs. They're just Arabs. They're Jordanians and Egyptians, which by the way is even kind of somewhat fake too, coming from various colonial countries that were created by England and other European countries. But still, they're just Arabs, and and that when one looks at the comparison of what happened, what they could have created in Gaza, and they got billions and billions in aid from the United States and Western countries, and all of that money went into building a massive terrorist tunnel structure and regime dedicated to the genocidal destruction of the state of Israel. As October 7th has shown, and as the October 7th war in Gaza has shown for the past 18 months.
Yeah. Um, Thank you, PC, for another super chat. PC says, Razi, my mom's first husband was an Arab. He disliked his culture from Egypt. He moved to the US. Yeah, and this is also why I haven't looked into it. I don't know how comprehensive Trump's new travel ban is. It makes sense generally, but it should provide for some mechanism where the best people in these countries are of great benefit to us if we could get them. And I hope that
Mhm.
can be done. Daniel.
Yeah, I haven't checked the sort of Trump's things also, but if it's a travel ban, that could still mean that sort of the what you call them, like asylums might still be sort of like available, which is sort of like what you might care for the most, especially like people fleeing from persecution. Now, sort of like Anna mentioned that, I also wanted to mention that Israel is now sort of like more modern, sort of like less sort of status than it was before. But also important to see that the Arabs in the region are much more savage than they were before. Israel used to fight against like nations where it could wipe out the army, it could quickly like get some strategic goals, and it was able to basically finish the war. Now the population is so embedded with Hamas, population is so like radicalized and is so basically bought into the ideology that even 600 days into war, Israel is still not able to really establish itself, and the Palestinians or the Arabs in Gaza are still fully with Hamas, are still supporting them, are still not surrendering, are still not hoping for any sort of difference. And the fact that now it's like Israel is a bigger pariah than it was in the past. That's what's if Ayn Rand was alive, that I'm wondering what you would like. What can you even say about like when you really think about sort of like how bad things were in the 60s and 70s, but realistically, how in many ways they are so much worse today, where the sort of like the moral travesty, if anything, of the fact that countries like Israel and in some cases like Ukraine, right, do not have like not even talking about like material support, but in many cases like moral support to fight against like dictatorships, to fight against like these civilizations whose whole purpose is simply to wipe out any sort of resemblance of Western, any sort of resemblance of modernity.
Yeah.
Yeah, when Ayn Rand answered that question, Arab countries were, had expropriated the oil that Westerners discovered and then sold it to the Westerners who discovered them. So we were basically trading with them, but for stuff that they have no right to. Uh, we've taken it up a notch with the Palestinians. There is no trade, and it was always been a one-sided like this. Gaza was the highest per capita recipient of so-called humanitarian aid before October 7th. It's a gift for being backwards. That's what it is. And again, Rand was very clear on why, uh, coming from her rational perspective, this is obviously uh, the choice is very, very clear. And when we go back to this survey, it tells us a lot about how about the cultures we live in. There was this great talk by Barry Weiss about a month after October 7th, the last line of defense, and she does say about how you can tell where a culture is headed by how it treats the Jews in that culture. There's more to that talk, Daniel. I don't know if you have it and can put it in the chat, but yeah, some of the countries I'm gonna skip some of them, but let's look at the numbers in Japan, for example, 79%. Now, I don't know Japanese culture well enough. I do know it was much worse, and then they lost the war, and now they're better, so it's maybe only 79%. Netherlands, 78% is a very big surprise because uh, the enemy that Israel is fighting, and clearly they don't see it that way, but is an enemy that the Netherlands should realize exists in their midst. Yeah, in the UK, by the way, 61%. It's not one of the higher countries, but it is still terrifyingly high. Have a negative view of Israel. Yeah, Adam, when you look at these numbers, what do you think of where these countries are going to be 5, 10 years from now?
Yeah, well, that is so it's always hard to make a prediction where a country's going to be. There's so many factors that come into play. But yeah, I mean, look, it's the speech that you described by Barry Weiss, by the way, is this talk that she gave in Washington, D.C. Um, and yeah, that kind of inspired me to start speaking up about these issues. Incredibly insightful, incredibly meaningful talk, and a very moving talk. And she ends it with calls to action specifically. So it's not just a complaining talk. It's a let me talk about how bad the world has become. And so I think there are a lot of things that are going on here, right? So first of all, what one sees, especially in America, and especially more so, even more so on the left, the political left, the Democrats, as they define themselves, political left, that the role of altruism here, right? That the role of you see people driven towards thinking, well, Israel is a successful country and it's powerful, and here are these weak Arabs in Gaza and in Samaria and Judea, which Jordan called the West Bank after Jordan lost the 67 war, uh, and um, uh, and you know so you have a duty to help them, you have a duty to sacrifice for them, you have a duty to do these things for them. And if they attack you, right, then the good response is to turn the other cheek, right, to not respond, or to respond, quote, proportionally, which means you pinprick them back and then you step back and don't do anything else. And so you can see, the role in which kind of altruism, both as an individual moral theory, and kind of in society more broadly in a culture, is really, disarming people's ability to recognize why Israel is good and why it should be defended. And Iran made this identify this not just about Israel, but about America and about the America as a beacon of Western civilization and everything that's good about Western civilization. And it's not a coincidence at all that all of the anti-Israel, pro-Hamas activists in the United States hate America, right? They're burning American flags just as much as they're burning Israeli flags. They're calling for the destruction of America just as much as they're calling for the destruction of Israel. And as Ayn Rand said in 1973, that Israel was fighting basically a war against the Soviet Union, right? Israel is not fighting a war against Hamas. Israel is fighting a war against the leading representative of the anti-Western ideology that currently exists as an ideological force in the world, and that is in Iran. And that is this Islamic totalitarian jihadist attitude that is a holdover from kind of the Middle Ages. What Christianity used to be in the Middle Ages, Islam is now. And it is and it strives to destroy all of capitalism, success, happiness, freedom, limited government, and all of these entities that we talk about, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Liberation Front, uh, Hamas, the Houthis, who literally are barbarians in the desert firing, ballistic missiles. There's only one way that are able to do that, Iran, right? And then like countries like Qatar, which is, it's just a criminal state, right? It's just a bunch of thugs, but they've been given millions and millions of dollars, right? Both from their oil money, which Western companies helped them discover, and more additional funding from Iran. So, this is, I think this is what we need to recognize and identify is that this is a fight for civilization, and Israel, just as much as it was a beachhead in that fight for civilization in the 1960s and 70s, in the fight against the Soviet Union. Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, and Putin is not a communist. He's just a dictator. He's just a thug, right? He doesn't stand for an ideology. Countries and entities and cultures that stand for an ideology especially an anti-Western ideology, are the threat, and we are facing that in an incredibly nihilistic culture and threat from this kind of Islamic threat from Iran primarily. And then Iran should have been the country we should have taken out after 9/11, because they were ultimately the driving force behind that attack, even though the terrorist in that attack came primarily from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, Iran. I would put Saudi Arabia on the list. I'd put Qatar on the list of potential targets. I mean, the Qatar point is an important one. Yeah, they are a bunch of thugs. They are, they're gifting America a plane. By the way, 747. They make safer
Yeah.
planes nowadays. But they're gifting a plane that they could afford with the money that from the stuff they took by force from America. It's great when somebody buys you a gift with your money. Um, yeah. To
By the way, Razi, I want to say, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a really interesting case right now. I would have agreed with you 20 or 30 years ago about Saudi Arabia. But one of the functions or reasons why Hamas engaged in the October 7th attack was to stop the treaty that was being drafted at that moment between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And Saudi Arabia is starting to liberalize. They're allowing women to drive and have jobs, and and they've banned actually all of these radical Islamic terrorist organizations, right? And by the way, the UAE is another really great example to show you like there isn't something intrinsic to Arab. This is a cultural issue. This is an intellectual issue. It's an ideological issue, because like the UAE is a really good country, right? And it shows you that you can have a good country like that in the Middle East. That is far more. It's still not, completely free, and it's not completely Western, but it's about as close as you got of any other country in the Middle East, as far as I know. I could be wrong about that.
So I actually had a very interesting conversation about the UAE last night, and I Agree it's the best of the Arab countries, although that is not exactly high praise. But it's still,
Yeah.
we still the story I bring up, and there have been a few stories in British media about women who went to Dubai on holiday, got raped, went to the police to report it, and got arrested because they had sex outside of wedlock, which is illegal regardless of whether or not you consented. They talk about not having crime, but they don't say what exactly it is they do to anybody who's suspected of a crime. So it's still a dictatorship. And the person I was talking to was also saying, yeah, they're on a journey, and I really hope that is what's going on. And I acknowledge the fact that, in countries, and I gave the example of Iran. Iran is not anywhere near what the UAE is, but population-wise, we know that if the current regime falls, it might, we see people in Iran risking their lives protesting against their totalitarian government, while we see people in the West protesting, demanding totalitarianism, and there could come a day where we're all refugees in Dubai. But I, at the moment, like
Yeah.
I'm not one to get in on the ground floor, so to
Yeah.
speak, the
But
Dubai experiment, and with Saudi Arabia as well. You remember, you might remember this
yeah.
before October 7th. Thomas Friedman wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying that Saudi Arabia shouldn't normalize relations with Israel right now because it legitimizes the Netanyahu government. And to me, I've been against the Abraham Accords because I think again you are legitimizing, and that's how I think about it. You're legitimizing a country that is still a dictatorship by doing so. And I would encourage them to move along in that journey and wait until
I
they reach a nicer destination before
I say
normalizing.
I think I disagree with you. Well, I don't think I do disagree with you because I do support the Abraham Accords. I think that, what is, and I support it for several reasons. But before I mention the Abraham Accords, I want to go back and just mention something real quick because earlier you were like, so what predictions based upon these, these surveys do you have for countries going forward? And by the way, this conversation we're having about the UAE and Saudi Arabia right now reflects how hard it is to make predictions about where countries are going to end up. Because if you had said in 2005, like Saudi Arabia is going to be normalizing or trying to normalize its relations with Israel, people would have been like, "Are you insane?" Like all the 9/11 terrorists came from Saudi Arabia. They're rife with all of these radical mosques, and they're one of the sources of terrorism in this world. But yet, if I jump forward 20 years, and they have, they're not a free country, but they're moving in the right direction. Right. The orientation is correct. I mean, countries don't, in cultures especially, don't change like this, right? So something that we kind of don't recognize very often is the American Revolution was really weird historically. It's never happened before, where you have this radical shift and a good shift that fast, that quickly, where you had that much of a concentration of good people, James Madison and President George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and and Thomas Paine, and all these incredible people who had been informed by centuries before that of all of this really good thinking and scholarship about natural rights and limited government and things of this sort. It takes steps, right? So this is something that you learn when you're a lawyer, especially in common law systems, that change is gradual, and occurs over long periods of time. And so you look at the orientation and and if Saudi Arabia and countries like UAE are moving in the right direction, you want to support that. You want to say, yes, that's good. Keep going in the direction you're going. Of course, you're not going to become a representative democracy tomorrow. And of course, you're not, there's not going to be 100% civil rights on Monday, even though it's Thursday. But you're moving in the right direction, and you want to support that because that's a good movement. And the Abraham Accords are good, not because they're, sanctioning these bad countries. They're good for the same reason that the peace accords that Israel entered into with Egypt, and with blanking on the other country. It was one other country it entered into a peace accord.
Jordan?
Jordan?
Jordan, I think. What?
Yeah, Jordan.
Jordan, right? Ended up being incredibly important, right? because it removed an immediate military threat to Israel, and it removed a government that was dedicated to a massive military confrontation with Israel, which had been which then required Israel to divert a lot of its resources to defense in a way that that prevented it from moving on out of a kind of a nonstop emergency situation. Which by the way, then correlated with Israel starting to free itself, right? Because when you're in a military emergency where you are surrounded by enemies and you're worried about attack day in, day out, like it's much harder to say, well, we're going to have a free economy and we're going to let people make decisions because you got to direct a lot of your attention and resources to just mere survival. And so normalizing these relationships is a really important step. And there's a reason why Hamas saw that as a threat. Well, not Hamas, Iran, because Iran is directing Hamas, right? There's a reason why Iran wanted to stop that. And I think it's because they see that that would reinforce the liberalizing influences that are occurring in Saudi Arabia, and it would eliminate another source of an immediate threat on Israel and free up Israel to then focus more on the real enemy, which is Iran, right? So yeah, I mean, are these things perfect? No, but I mean, but having recognition, state recognition of the existence of Israel as you exist, which is what Egypt and Jordan did, right, is a really significant step and it's an important step. And it gives them local legitimacy and a voice and an additional voice in organizations like the UN and other places where they can continue to fight the moral fight that they need to fight, which they're doing a very bad job at anyway.
So, okay, some of this is definitely a topic for a different day because
Yeah.
I think that the so-called peace deal with Egypt is a disaster to Israel.
Mhm.
But maybe you and I will have a one-on-one show about
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
various peace deals on the Daily Objective at some point because uh it's a fascinating topic. And
Well,
like you said,
it was valid. Let me say it was the peace deal with Egypt was good up until the Muslim Brotherhood took over. Because then Egypt changed and they kind of they became more like Iran, but they had their treaty with Israel, so then they continued then they did things like supporting Hamas, right, secretly and quietly and things like that.
Um, well, I had a problem. I have a problem with the way it was originally, but we'll
Oh, okay.
talk
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. Happy.
But I will say, yeah, my question about how we can see these trends, what can we expect these countries to become in the future is difficult in some point to some extent. When you look at the countries that had the most favorable views towards Israel, Nigeria is 59%, Kenya 50%. I don't know what we can read into that because I don't know enough about those societies. I don't know pretty much anything about those societies. US 45%, again, that is the scariest one to me. As I said, these are favorable. India 34%, and I can kind of guess why that is. In the case of India, they kind of face a similar issue. Uh, and of course, one that I enjoy is South Africa, 34%. Every time we've done a bunch of shows on South Africa, they almost all of them get like 30,000 views or
Hmm.
something insane, and almost all those views are from South Africa, and almost all of them, basically almost all the comments in those episodes are don't call it South Africa, it's the ANC. And I point out, look, sorry, if you don't like a Trump policy, I'm not gonna not call it American policy. He is the president, and that is your country's policy. But I understand it, and this stat is interesting, and also helps understand it. Daniel, you were on a bunch of those South Africa episodes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean that sort of plays in the role of sort of like the difference between the people and the leadership. And depending on what system you have, those differences get smaller, right? So for example, just to mention like Saudi Arabia, that is one of the few countries that's still like an absolute monarchy. Like the king has and the crown prince have like all the power they pretty much want to get away. And there is sort of like a pragmatic, I think, bent the current sort of like crown prince of Saudi Arabia has. I think at some point he was quoted, he doesn't care about the Palestinian issue. And I think sort of purely pragmatically, they are aligned with the Western powers because they have the same enemies, right? Saudi Arabia doesn't like the Houthis, have fought against them, doesn't like Iran, has fought against them, doesn't like any of this. So they are sort of like aligned. But then you also have the people, and I think the sort of the people of Saudi Arabia. Not sure how much sort of like I think they are pro-Palestinian and they are not as quick to sort of like liberalize. But I think that it's definitely like an interesting discussion because I was trying to think of like a country that like went through like a liberal process like purely on its own. And the only thing I can think of is like United Kingdom that like went through like the whole process, sort of that wasn't like defeated in a war and then had like an ideology like imposed on it and had to sort of like fight in that. Because if you think of like Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, all of them like did the liberal process like relatively quickly, like went from like dictatorships, all of them were dictatorships, and went through like liberal democracies in a span of like half a century, which if we can do that with Saudi Arabia, that would be pretty amazing. But there will be sort of like my worry is like I feel like there needs to be a catalyst for like this like great sort of move towards liberalization, which would be my biggest worry about Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. I mean, it's not going to come from, so, so one of the mistakes that was made in the last couple of decades is liberalization doesn't come from exposing people to open markets and prosperity, right? So that, that was kind of the, the neocon perspective, like, oh, free markets and and prosperity of the markets and that when people are better off then they want to become more liberal and they want to become liberal in the proper sense of the term. Classical liberal sometimes it's used, and more free. And um I think the last last 10 years showed that that was false, that it has the it ha it, there it has the causation reversed. It's the liberalism that leads to the free markets, that leads to the that leads to the prosperity. And if you're not committed to the liberalism ideologically, then the prosperity is not going to create a natural drive or an interest in wanting to be free politically. And where we've seen that is in China, right? China became incredibly prosperous, and they're now in the process of becoming even more authoritarian, and a threat and a military threat to the West. So, um, but the studies that in the that Razi is kind of going through, in some respects, it's disheartening and scary. Um, in other respects, one might also say like, I wonder if really there has been any actual fundamental change in what some people really believed. Because the underlying collectivist premises that drive statist regimes and the collectivism that drives underlying collectivist premises that drive tribalism and ultimately racism and things like anti-Semitism, have always been there. They're not checked. These countries aren't, fundamentally individualist countries. America was a fundamentally individualist country, and it's shifting away from that, right? And so you're seeing the impact on this. I think what's happened is that October 7th unleashed and made acceptable expressing again these collectivist premises. And so became permissible again to say, yeah, yay, Hamas, those oppressed people. Let's stick it to those oppressor Israelis, those quote anti-Zionists. So I was just arguing on X with another so-called anti-Zionist who ultimately said, go to the chambers, you pig. I'm like, all right, there he goes. Once more, once more the claim anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism has been proven. So but that's scary, right? Because because the recognition that one should not be racist, right, is even if one fundamentally is inclined to being so because one shares the ideas with collectivism that would drive one to recognize and support racism, the social taboo on being racist prevents you from acting on it and expressing it. And when that social taboo is removed, countries degrade into violence. And what have we been witnessing the past several months, especially with respect to Jews in America and in Europe, is massive, more increased violence, anti-Semitic attacks, especially in America, which has never happened before. I mean, in a span of 2 months, right? We had the firebombing of a governor's mansion because he was Jewish by a man who screamed Free Palestine. We had the cold-blooded execution of 2 Jews in Washington, D.C. by another man screaming Free Palestine. And 4 days ago, we had a man firebomb a bunch of elderly American Jews who were gathered to call for the release of the hostages. One of them was a Holocaust survivor who got burned alive by him, screaming Free Palestine. This is a serious, serious problem. And it doesn't end well. This is how it starts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and all those the terrorist attack in DC did follow the a couple days when we heard 14,000 babies are about to be starved to death. The firebomb was it wasn't after the 31 people killed in a massacre, right? But it was around that time. You
It was
have
that mo it was that morning actually.
yeah, so you have the media knowingly promoting Hamas propaganda, knowing what the result is, and then seeing the result happen and then doubling down. And that is also terrifying because again, the people in the protests and certainly the people committing these terrorist attacks are not independent thinkers. They need somebody to move them along to where they are, and the media is happy to oblige, and that is absolutely terrifying. Uh, we have a few minutes left. I want to quickly, Daniel, I'll go to you in a second. I just want to so part of this survey that Pew conducted was also there were 1,000 people surveyed in Israel and 53% viewed about Netanyahu. There's a Netanyahu portion of this which we didn't get to, but 53% viewed Netanyahu negatively. Now, Gantz, one of the, I don't know who the formal leader of the opposition, but Gantz is 54% negative, and Lapid is 61% negative. So Netanyahu is basically the one with the lowest unfavorable result. And this was done in March and February and March, so during the ceasefire. And yeah, I don't know what that says, but I do know that in Israel, I don't think this is people understand how serious it is because they keep focusing their efforts on saying, look, no, it's not what you think. You don't understand the facts on the ground. No, this is not about the facts. This is about the values, and the values align with the savages, and that is what should terrify us. Daniel.
Yeah, I don't think there's much to say about the numbers of like Netanyahu's sort of favorability, especially in like a coalition type governments. That sounds like incredibly good numbers, like 47% favorability rating. I'll take that. Uh, but yeah, I mean, sort of like separately about I guess to finish up on the rise of anti-Semitism or the rise of sort of open anti-Semitism is I always use the example people might remember before October 7th, few years there was a post by Kanye West when he just randomly posted that he's gonna go DEFCON 5 on the Jews, and he was canceled for it. He was lost a deal with was it Adidas or Nike? He was completely like shunned, and nobody wanted to do anything with him. And I always say, if only he waited 2 years, he probably could have gotten away with it.
Well, not probably. He has. He released a music song called Heil Hitler. And no one blinked. No one said anything other than huh. And the entire song is a bunch of people chanting Heil Hitler.
Yeah. People
Yeah,
who, of course, would be gassed to death by Hitler as well.
yeah,
But
I know. Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, just like the Queers for Palestine. Like, you would be the first people thrown off from the tall buildings.
Daniel, where can people find you?
You can find me on my YouTube channel, Dan to Dan. It's going to be in the description.
Adam, where can people find you?
You're interested in these types of issues on X, Adam Mossoff handle.
I'm Rozzy Ginsburg on X. We are doing it live, as Bill O'Reilly once said, on July 1st in Boston. Make sure you join us. The Daily Objective, the reality show, and more at that event. Those two shows will be live streamed. We're going to do that again later this year in California. Plan to be there in October. We'll give more details when we can. Tomorrow. The Daily Objective, how Netanyahu is arming the next Hamas in Gaza. Yeah, I don't know if you hear this stuff elsewhere, but you'll hear it here. And yeah, the UN wants to, how did they put it? Do something about fixing the fake news and disinformation problem on social media. Yeah, who do you trust more than the UN to make sure that only the truth is allowed to be told? Thanks, Daniel. Oh, I'm Razi Ginsburg on X if I haven't said so before. Daniel, thank you. Adam, thank you. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Thanks. Cheers.